The unforgiving American frontier of the mid-1800s offered both the promise of a new life and the constant threat of unimaginable hardship. Settlers venturing westward faced not only the elements and vast, untamed landscapes, but also the ever-present danger of betrayal from within their own ranks. What you are about to hear is a harrowing account pieced together from a surgeon's journal, kept during the Civil War era, and letters penned from desolate outposts like Fort Dodge and Fort Snelling, revealing a forgotten incident of frontier justice, a man buried alive by his own company. The events described unfold through the grim observations of Dr. Elias Thorne, a surgeon serving with a detachment of Union soldiers tasked with establishing a new fort deep in hostile territory in 1863. He recounts the disturbing circumstances surrounding the fate of Private Jedediah Stone, a man whose arrogance and escalating brutality became a fatal burden to his fellow men. As documented in a letter from Fort Snelling, dated April 1863, our company, part of the 17th Ohio Volunteers, was dispatched to the Western Territories with orders to secure supply routes and establish a new outpost. We were a diverse group, but shared a common purpose in taming this wild land. Among us was Private Stone, a physically imposing man, but one whose temperament was as volatile as a summer storm. His boisterous boasts and casual cruelty towards anyone he deemed beneath him were well known, even before our departure from our staging grounds near Fort Leavenworth. He had been a thorn in the side of every command he'd served under, leaving a trail of discord and minor insurrections in his wake. The detachment, comprising roughly 50 men, pushed steadily westward, the landscape growing more desolate with each passing day. Thorne's journal entry from late May 1863 details a series of increasingly disturbing incidents involving Stone. He chronicles Stone's flagrant disregard for orders, his cruel mistreatment of the pack animals, and, most alarmingly, his unprovoked assaults on local inhabitants, including a chilling incident involving the desecration of a sacred tribal burial ground. His actions were not merely a nuisance. They were a direct threat to the fragile peace the officers attempted to maintain with the wary indigenous tribes and, more immediately, to the morale and safety of the company itself. The men, though disciplined, grew increasingly wary and resentful of Stone's unchecked aggression. They urged him, at first politely, then with growing desperation, to temper his behavior, fearing that his recklessness would draw untold calamity upon them all. But Stone, fueled by a perverse sense of invincibility, scoffed at their warnings, deeming their caution as cowardice. The breaking point arrived during a grueling march through an uncharted canyon. A sudden, violent sandstorm descended upon them, disorienting the column and forcing a hasty encampment. In the chaos, Private Stone, for reasons unknown, attacked one of the company's vital scout guides, a seasoned frontiersman, with unbridled ferocity, leaving him for dead. The act was senseless, born of pure malice, and committed in full view of the bewildered company. The men were horrified by this cold-blooded betrayal. The scout, though gravely wounded, miraculously survived, but the incident sealed Stone's fate. The officers, faced with an act of such depravity and aware that Stone's continued presence jeopardized the entire mission and the lives of every man, knew they could not return him to civilization, nor could they let his dangerous behavior continue. As the sandstorm began to subside, a chilling silence fell over the camp. The air was thick with unspoken agreement. The company, battered and exhausted, gathered around Stone, their faces grim and resolute. There was no sympathy for him. His actions had irrevocably severed the bonds of comradeship. The leaders, after a brief, tense deliberation, informed Stone of their decision. His fate was sealed, not by an enemy, but by the very man he had sworn to serve alongside. Realizing the gravity of his situation, the trembling wretch pleaded and begged his fellow soldiers for mercy, but his cries were in vain. He had brought this upon himself, and he would have to face the consequences. Without further ceremony, the men set about their grim task. They forced Stone to dig his own grave, a shallow pit in the shifting sand, his frantic pleas echoing eerily in the vast emptiness of the canyon. The sun beat down mercilessly as he toiled, his body slick with sweat and terror. Once the pit was deemed deep enough, they compelled him to descend into it. The earth, still churned from the recent storm, was then shoveled back into the grave, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, burying him alive. Stone struggled and screamed in agony, his suffering terrible and miserable. He begged, prayed, and cursed, but his pleas went unanswered. The gruesome work continued, the unbearable torment unrelenting. Having brutally betrayed his own kind, He now faced the frontier's ultimate punishment. The detachment had been pushing for weeks across the terrain that seemed to actively resist their progress. Dr. Thorne's entries from early June, still within his journal, speak of dwindling rations, parched water sources, and the constant threat of ambushes from unseen hostiles. Morale was a fragile thing, stretched thin by the relentless demands of the journey. Every man carried his own burden of fatigue and fear, and the last thing they needed was the added weight of an unstable and violent individual in their ranks. The air was thick with tension, not just from external dangers, but from the internal threat posed by Stone. His presence was a cancerous growth within the company, poisoning the camaraderie and trust essential for survival in such unforgiving circumstances. The men, who relied on each other implicitly for their very lives, found Stone's selfish disregard for their collective well-being an unforgivable sin. There had been whispers among the ranks, hushed conversations around dying campfires, about what should be done with him. Some suggested simply abandoning him in the vast wilderness, leaving him to face the elements alone. Others, more grimly, spoke of an accident during a skirmish, but no one had dared to act, held back by their soldier's oath and the faint hope that he might yet reform, or that a higher authority would intervene. Yet, the attack on the scout guide irrevocably shattered any illusions. This wasn't merely insubordination or ill temper, it was an act of pure, unadulterated treachery against a fellow human being, a man who had guided them safely through treacherous terrain. The scout, a stoic Cheyenne named Silent Elk, had been indispensable, his knowledge of the land and its dangers literally keeping them alive. Stone's attack, a vicious blow to the head, with a discarded pickaxe, was a direct assault on the company's lifeline. Dr. Thorne, in his journal, describes the profound shock and outrage that rippled through the ranks. He notes the cold fury in the eyes of Sergeant Miller, a grizzled veteran who had seen men die in countless ways, or rarely by the hand of one of their own without cause. Even Captain Davies, a man known for his unwavering adherence to military protocol, seemed to age years in that single, horrific moment. The scout, miraculously, had clung to life, his breathing shallow, a deep gash bleeding profusely from his temple. Thorne himself had worked frantically to stem the flow of blood, his hands shaking not from fear, but from a profound sense of injustice. The sandstorm, a blinding, suffocating whirlwind that had initially obscured the attack, now served as a perverse witness to the company's silent deliberations. The wind howled like a banshee, whipping sand into their faces, a natural force mirroring the internal storm raging within the men. There was no formal court-martial, no lengthy trial under frontier law. The exigencies of survival dictated their actions. To continue with Stone was to invite further disaster, to endanger every life under Captain Davies' command. The unspoken verdict was unanimous, etched into the hardened faces of men who understood the brutal calculus of the frontier. Life was cheap, but collective survival was paramount. As the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the dunes, the wind began to die down, leaving behind an eerie stillness. The atmosphere was thick with the weight of what was about to transpire. Private Stone, initially defiant, his eyes still burning with a dangerous spark, slowly crumbled as the grim reality of his situation dawned on him. The men who stood before him were no longer his comrades. They were the collective embodiment of the frontier's unforgiving justice. He began to beg, his voice cracking, his pleas a desperate, pathetic counterpoint to the profound silence that surrounded them. He invoked God, his mother, anything that might stir a flicker of mercy in their hardened hearts. But there was none to be found. His transgressions had been too great, his betrayal too profound. The act of digging his own grave was a final, agonizing humiliation. Each scoop of sand, each grunt of effort, was a testament to his downfall. He knew, with terrifying certainty, that this was the end. As he was forced into the shallow pit, the cold earth rising around him, his screams became guttural, animalistic. The men, their faces expressionless masks, began to shovel the sand back, the rhythmic thud of earth hitting earth the chilling accompaniment to Stone's dying wails. There was no malice in their movements, only grim determination. They were not acting out of vengeance, but out of necessity. They were burying not just a man, but a threat, a danger that had to be neutralized for the good of the whole. The last sounds were muffled, then silenced completely as the earth claimed him. The soldiers remained, standing vigil over the freshly turned earth, their shadows lengthening in the fading light. A solemn understanding passed between them, a shared burden and a collective resolve. Only when the last rays of sunlight had vanished and the stars began to prick the vast, dark sky did they finally turn and march on, leaving behind the fresh mound of earth as a stark monument to a forgotten betrayal, a chilling testament to the brutal justice of the unforgiving frontier. The incident, though rarely spoken of, would become a silent chapter in the history of the 17th Ohio Volunteers, a grim reminder of the lengths to which men would go to survive, even when faced with the agonizing necessity of burying one of their own.